All right, so welcome back to another midweek with Double Creek. Today we're in week 22 out of our 52 weeks with Jesus from the book by James Merritt. That has us still in section 4. We're in the 4th week of section 4, which is 12 weeks long. This section is called Jesus the Storyteller. And so each week in this section we are looking at a story, a parable that Jesus told. We've looked at 3 very famous parables already during this section right here. The first week of section 4, we looked at the parable of the sower. The second week, we looked at the parable of the workers in the vineyard. Last week, we looked at the parable of the Good Samaritan. Those are parables that most people really enjoy. And so we looked at those. But today we're looking at a parable that for some people, to be honest with you, some people don't care for it. It's uncomfortable for them some way, especially the way it ends. And I think the reason being for that is because this parable can really put some people in their place. People who are just content, people who are just satisfied, who are just not putting forth the effort that God needs them to. So let's get into today's lesson. Today's lesson, this chapter is called The Divine Auditor. Now, each week we kind of do this but knowing that we're looking at a parable of Jesus and that the title of this is called The Divine Auditor, which one might we be looking at today? Well, when you think about it, the purpose of an auditor is what? They inspect financial records, financial accounts to ensure that they are correct and that they are legal and they comply with the law. And so since this is about someone who checks accounts, today we are looking at the parable that we call the parable of the talents. This parable takes place in Matthew chapter 25. We'll get into all this parable of the talents here in a bit, but I first want to read this parable. It's a little bit longer than a couple of the other ones we've looked at so far, but I think it's really important that we read each one of these parables each week so that we can get the whole story of what's going on. This parable comes from Matthew chapter 25 verses 14 through 30. And it says this: "For it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another was 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, 'Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master.' And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward saying, 'Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here, I have made 2 talents more.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master.' He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, 'Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours.' But his master answered him, 'You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has, will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Okay, so I did say this one's a little bit longer of a parable, but it's a very important parable we're looking at today. And Merritt starts this chapter off by talking about a kingdom melody. Now, when you hear the word melody, what maybe comes to your mind? What do you think of? I think of music and how different sounds come together to make something beautiful. For some reason, I also think about the Righteous Brothers and their song that they sang that's so popular, Unchained Melody. But Merritt talks about it in this way, with bands and orchestras. He points out that you see or you hear bands and orchestras at all kinds of things. Football games, musicals, whether it's Broadway or something local that you've been to. You hear them in Disney World. They're with Mickey and Minnie and all these other things. We see and we hear bands and we hear orchestras at so many places, but sometimes we just don't pay attention to them because that's not what we paid the money to go see. So while we enjoy that music, we typically paid to see something else, and that music is just kind of part of the background for us in many ways. Well, Merritt points out that if you study famous musicians over the course of history, many of them learn to play a particular instrument really well from being in some sort of a band or an orchestra. That's where many of them first learned to play that musical instrument. Now, children start at a very young age with these things sometimes, in school bands or orchestras. And then there are others who they learn to even play a particular instrument on their own, or they get individual lessons. But playing in a band, playing in an orchestra, gives them something different. They get the opportunity to play alongside other people who are playing either the same instrument or different instruments. And so in doing so, playing in a band or orchestra, they learn to blend in with other instruments, not overpower them. They also learn to keep up with the tempo of the music. They learn when it's important to play louder. They learn when it's important to play softer. They learn to follow a conductor. Now, these are things that are learned while playing in bands and orchestras. And so as Merritt points out, what is true of a band or orchestra in that way is even truer for us as Christians, a community of believers. So for our time together, let's think about our church here at Double Creek Church of Christ, or if you're listening from another church, your church, for this next 15 minutes or 20 minutes or so. Because this is really a parable that Jesus tells about people who are playing their parts and how important this is to the church and to God's kingdom. So in a band or orchestra, obviously we understand and we know that not everyone plays the same instrument, right? And so what makes that music so beautiful is how all of the different instruments and all the different types of music, they blend together. It's that melody really that they create. Think about how boring it would be if you were listening to a band or an orchestra and they all played the same exact instrument. It wouldn't go over well, would it? Some instruments are going to be louder in a band and an orchestra. Some parts are going to be bigger than others. Some parts are more noticeable. But that doesn't take away from the significance of any of the instruments, does it? They're all important. They all play an important role in how everything turns out in the end. And when you think about it, that's how it is with us in the church, isn't it? It's not how much we have that matters to Jesus. It's what we do with what we have that matters to Jesus. So our role, our part of our part of our responsibility as Christians is to use what we have to glorify God and to grow God's kingdom. And so Merritt then points out three God-given things that I think we need to understand here. The first is that we have a God-given opportunity to play our parts. And so let's understand this here. This should not just be an option for us. And this is really, I think, a major theme of this parable that Jesus was talking about here. Jesus tells the story in Matthew 25 about a master who is getting ready to go on a long journey, be out of town for a while. And so he entrusts his property to three servants. Now the key word there is entrust, or he entrusted. When you think about it, what does the word entrusted mean? Basically, it means that you put something into someone else's care or protection. Now, when you think about it, it's a big responsibility, isn't it? When somebody puts something that they own in your care and your responsibility. It means that they have enough confidence in you as a person that you can handle that responsibility. That you're willing to leave what you have in that person's care when you were gone. That's a lot of confidence. So this man had taken his property, his money, whatever he had, and he entrusted it to these three servants to use it productively and to make a profit. And so each servant here in this parable was given the opportunity to show what they could do with this man's investment. It'd be similar to, for us, to have a boss at work who puts us in charge in a huge, an extremely important project that just needs to be done, and they don't have the time to do it. So they put you in charge of it. Now, if your boss left you over a project like this to do, you understand that your boss has confidence in you, or they wouldn't have asked you when they could have asked someone else. But also, your boss trusts you to get the job done. And so that's similar to what it was like for these servants here in Matthew chapter 25. The master is leaving, but instead of bringing someone who others would maybe think is more qualified to run everything, to run his business, to run whatever, he hands it over to these servants. Well, it's exactly what Jesus does with us as human beings here today, isn't it? In today's world, in the church. Just like in this parable, not everyone is given an equal amount of what Jesus called talents here. Different people are born into different situations, different environments. We have different types of gifts and different types of abilities, don't we? Now, we think of talents as abilities or gifts today, don't we? But in that day, when Jesus was talking about a talent, it was a measure of money. So the value of one talent could be worth up to 20 years of wages for the average worker. So when this one servant got one talent, he was given basically 20 years, if he wanted to sit back, relax, and do nothing, to not have to work. And as we saw, he was content with that. He just went out, he dug a hole, and he hid the talent and didn't use it. But the others, they received 5 talents and 2 talents each. That was enough to get through the rest of his life. The rest of their lives, especially with the 5 talent, when to get through the rest of his life with some left over, plenty left over. It was enough for the one who got 2 talents to go some 40 years on that money. But that's not the point of this parable, is it? You see, even though each man was given a different amount, in the eyes of his master, each one of these servants had been given a sufficient amount of money. Just because they were given unequal amounts doesn't mean that it wasn't enough. There are no unimportant parts in God's orchestra. What we must understand here tonight is that we all have a God-given opportunity to play our parts. What we do with that opportunity is what matters. Because we don't just have a God-given opportunity, we also have a God-given responsibility to play our parts. See, each servant in this parable, they have been given some talents. They have some ability. Not the same, but some ability. But with that ability comes the opportunity to make something special happen. And as a Christian, for us here today, having these opportunities to grow God's kingdom carries with it the responsibility to use our abilities for God's glory. You know, we've each been given abilities by God. Abilities to use for the growth of His kingdom. We have different and unique personalities. We have some who are more creative than other people. We have some who are willing to work hard. Some who are great with their hands. Whatever ability it is that we have, God wants us to use it for His kingdom, doesn't He? And two of those servants understood that in this parable. The one who received the 5 talents, he went out and traded with them, and he made 5 more. The one who had the 2 did the same. He went out and traded, and he came back with 2 more. But the one servant who had 1 talent, who was given 1 talent, did nothing with it. He just hid his talent in the ground. He was afraid to do anything with it, he said. Now the question for us today, I think, becomes this. What do we do with the abilities that God's given us? Do we do anything with them? Because God's given us abilities. What do we do with them? Now, I've seen many people here at Double Creek Church of Christ in the last 3 years or so that we've been here that take those talents, take those abilities, and use them. Some of you have been using them for years, maybe even decades. I've also seen some people stop using their abilities. Now, let me say this. There are reasons for that. Because there comes a time, doesn't it, when our bodies don't allow us to use our abilities like we were once able to, doesn't it? And I really believe that it's at that time where others in the community, others in the church, are expected to step up and use their God-given responsibilities, their God-given abilities to play their part. I've seen some do that in the last couple of years. And it's exciting to see, isn't it, when people step up and volunteer to do different things. People have stepped up to be on the board here at this church. Others have stepped up to teach classes. Others have stepped up with Vacation Bible School, or others have stepped up with planning certain activities. All kinds of things that we've been doing. We've been doing a lot of new things here in the last year and a half. So we've all seen people step up and use their God-given abilities, their God-given responsibility. But you know what? There are also some who refuse to use their God-given abilities. And that's just the way it is, isn't it? And so that's why Jesus tells this parable, because it's always been that way. See, God wants people who are willing to use their God-given responsibilities, their God-given abilities for the glory of God and for the good of others. And so what is important to God is not what ability we have, but whether or not we use the abilities He's given us. And not just whether we use it, but how we use it. And so as Merritt points out, we have a God-given responsibility to play our parts, but we also have a God-given accountability to play our parts. And so what Jesus wants to make clear here in this parable is that God is watching to see what we do with what He has given us. One man was given 5 talents, he doubled them. Another servant was given 2 talents, he doubled them. Now did the one servant who got the 5 talents, and did he receive a greater reward for doubling his than the person who received 2 talents and doubled his to 4? No, they were both equally rewarded in this parable. The master looked at both of them and says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." He says, "You have been faithful over a little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master." You know they had to love hearing words like that from the master who had left them for so long, came back after a long period of time, and was pleased with what they had done. Well done, good and faithful servant. See, it didn't matter who ended up with the most because they had different talents. What matters was that they did, what matters is what they did with what they had. And so for us today, it doesn't matter who gets seen the most. It doesn't matter who gets heard the most. Or it doesn't even matter who is involved with the most activities. Because we all have different abilities. But what matters is really what we do with what God has blessed us with. In a way, it would be great if this story ended right here. But that's not life, is it? That's not how things really work, is it? Wouldn't it be great if we could all just receive the greatest reward given by God, entering into heaven? It would. But the Bible is clear. That's not the case. Because there are those who are not willing to take the opportunity to be responsible and accountable with their abilities. The abilities that God has blessed us with. Some are just going to be content with doing nothing, just like that servant who got one. And that's not what God wants. It's not what God expects of us. This is the part of the parable that I think becomes a little uncomfortable to some people. This is the part of the parable that some people don't like to hear. This is where some people don't like the teaching of Jesus a little bit. While the first two servants brought effort, that last servant, the one who got one, he brought nothing but excuses. It's interesting that the first two servants, all they say is, Master, you gave me 5 talents. Here, I've made 5 more. And the same thing with the 2. He said the same words. He just used 2 instead of 5. In just a few short words, they told what they did. But the man who did nothing with his talents from his master used 42 words to make an excuse for why he did nothing with his talents. 42 words to basically say, I didn't do anything. See, Jesus wants us to play our part. Jesus wants us to be accountable for what we do. It's not about getting the same results or even doing the same things. He just wants our effort. It's not what we have, it's what we do with what we have. And as Merritt points out, as we get ready to finish up, every player matters. On the football field, the players who get paid the most or get recognized the most on offense are the quarterback, the running back, the wide receivers. They're the ones seen with the ball in their hands making all the plays. But the offensive line is what really makes it all happen. Because without a great offensive line to block, the quarterback gets sacked. He gets hit a lot. He gets pressured. He gets beat up. Without a great offensive line, the wide receivers don't have time to run their routes and get open. Without a great offensive line, the running back has no holes to run through. So the highest paid player on the team is typically the quarterback. But a lot of people don't know that one of those offensive linemen gets paid really well too. It's usually the offensive tackle that protects the quarterback's blind side. The side behind him when he drops back to pass and he can't see what's coming behind him. Because that position is extremely important. Quarterback doesn't know what's coming often. So they need someone very important to block behind him when he drops back to pass. That position, typically the left offensive tackle for a right-handed quarterback, is said to be the second highest paid position in the NFL. A position that's not noticed by many people on the field because they don't get the ball in their hands. But he takes care of the most valuable and vulnerable spot for the offense. Now here's how all of this matters for us today. God's not looking for someone that has to be flashy, funny, outgoing or anything like that. So, sure, there are people that use those things, that have those talents, and they can use those talents, and they should. But not everybody has that. See, those are abilities from God. But God is just looking for us to recognize where He's blessed us with some ability, whatever it is, and use it to grow His kingdom. For some, they may be more in the spotlight, like that quarterback. For others, they may not be noticed as much, like that offensive tackle. But what's important for us to remember is that we don't all have the same types of gifts or abilities. But we do have gifts and abilities. So do we take the opportunity and the responsibility to be accountable with those gifts and those abilities that God has given us? Every player matters. Every player is extremely important, no matter what their role is. Whether it's in the band or an orchestra, whether it's on a team or in the church, every player matters, and every player is important. And when we use our gifts, when we play our parts, we can stand before God, who made us, and God can say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." I want to thank you for joining us here for week 22 of our 52 Weeks with Jesus, where we looked at the divine auditor. Jesus is looking for us to use our talents and our abilities. He's not looking for the church to put all the responsibility on one person or two people or a handful of people. He wants us each to use the abilities that He's blessed us with in some way. Maybe we'd be willing to do that. Thank you for joining us. God bless and have a great day.